Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in to our next webinar series. This is our NextGen Working to Advance Australia's Interest, the Life of an Aussie Diplomat series. Our special guest today is Mr McConville. He is the Deputy Head of Mission at the Australian Embassy in Seoul.
And welcome in what is our first NextGen webinar for the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Korea. So it's very exciting to have a very seasoned career diplomat like yourself here to talk with us today, particularly because we've got a number of our members from across the Australian Chamber from university today. So jumping into, where did you grow up and where did you go to university? Because I mean, you could have gone to university with a number of members joining today.
Thanks, Andrew, and yeah, very happy to be here today and to share some of my own journey to working in foreign policy and of course specifically with DFAT over a period of almost 30 years now. But I started my life in Melbourne, and that progressed down to the Mornington Peninsula. My father was a geography teacher, and we always loved our annual trip into inland Australia, and I guess that was the start of my interest in travel and discovering the world beyond my own home. And of course, it wasn't a big jump from living in the Mornington Peninsula to seize on Monash University as the place that I would then proceed to undertake my studies. But I must also add, I did take a gap year between school and university, which I found extremely edifying and rewarding, challenging as well. But it helped set me on the path to undertaking studies with a real focus on international affairs. And I think it was at the time in '84 when I got on that plane, first trip overseas, and I remember arriving at Bangkok airport and absolutely amazed at the sensation of totally new culture. England, of course, was interesting, but you know, had some similarities with Australia. But then coming back via India for a few weeks as an impressionable 19-year-old set me on the path to undertaking my Bachelor of Arts and then a Bachelor of Law at Monash University. So I focused very much on the international law aspect, picked up Bahasa Indonesia as part of my arts degree, had a major in Asian history, and for me, everything was set to applying for DFAT, which I did so in 1991.
Had you come across DFAT in any of those travels or whilst you were at university to know that that was something you wanted to do? Or was it purely just that experience of traveling the world and seeing these different cultures that made you want to think, oh, look, that's the career I want to pursue?
Yes, I do remember doing a career questionnaire when I was 15 years old, and it suggested I should be a trade commissioner. So I think there was clearly an interest I had at a young and impressionable age to living and working overseas. There were opportunities I had in my travels, particularly in Southeast Asia, to come across the embassies in the countries I was visiting, but it was really more gazing from the outside as a backpacker, wondering what it was like to be working inside, and maybe hoping in the future that it could indeed be me.
Yeah, no, it's quite an interesting path that you took there to go the gap year, because typically the gap year would be just straight to London, but you did take that trip through, you know, to the Asian continent, which, you know, that clearly is where you spent a lot of time as well, subsequently in your career too, now that you're posted here in Korea, and then equally down in what we can get to in some of the earlier part of your career too. Have you undertaken any further studies from those undergraduate degrees? I mean, you're well qualified, don't get me wrong, but did you undertake any further studies?
Yes, indeed. As part of our training, once I joined DFAT, we did a graduate diploma in foreign affairs and trade, and then it was optional to transform that into a Master of Arts as it happened at Monash University. So after about 6 or so years within DFAT, I had acquired a Master of Arts in Foreign Affairs and Trade, which was, of course, useful. And then after that, one of the benefits of DFAT has been language training. So to some extent, one could call that additional qualifications. So our first posting was Pakistan, and I was given 6 months of in-country language training in Urdu. And then subsequent to that, I've had almost a year learning French prior to heading off as High Commissioner in Mauritius.
And how much French and Urdu and Hausa and now Korean do you continue to hold?
Well, as they say, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And the problem with my language skills has been that I have enough to get me into danger and probably not enough to keep me out of. But over the years, my French has been my specialty, and I was able to acquire a level 4 on reading and speaking, which has been sufficient to keep me and enable me to operate in West Africa, which is primarily a Francophone region. And so I was accredited as ambassador to 4 Francophone countries, including Gabon and Niger, Cameroon, and the Republic of Congo. And in those that role, I was able to manage, I guess, with my French, even if at times it wasn't pretty.
And so it sounds like it was a very deliberate choice then to learn French to enable that career.
Yes, I think the French came following my appointment as High Commissioner to Mauritius, and that included accreditation to Madagascar, Seychelles, and Comores. So the French was useful as a sort of a lingua franca in that region, and the next posting was, of course, Nigeria, which in itself is an Anglophone country, but because of the way our accreditations work through, it was very useful for me to keep my French going. And the other spin-off, which ended up being advantageous for the family, was that we put our 3 children through the Francophone education system, starting from Mauritius, but also maintaining it in Canberra at the Tilapia School, keeping it going in Nigeria, and then maintaining it when we moved on to Geneva, which is also, of course, a Francophone country.
Yes, it's something I'd love to learn, would be a European language, but I've never managed to hold on to it despite my surname being very German. I've never managed to hold on to it. So moving, that's a very, very well credentialed. You've got a lot of experience, very, very well educated. And then moving into then your role now as the Deputy Head of Mission, or DHOM, here in the Australian Embassy in Korea. What is your role here in Seoul, and how would you distinguish that from the Head of Mission, so James Che? How do you distinguish between the roles? Is there always a head and a deputy in all the missions that you've worked in around the world? Like, interested to hear what actually is your role now here in Korea.
Yes, there's obviously a very clear distinction between the Head of Mission, Ambassador James Che, and myself. as deputy. And of course, my role is very much to support his work and his profile and engagement in the broader community. But it's an enormous bilateral relationship, and given the equities for us, that is why we do have a standalone deputy role. And to some extent, that deputy role has a public profile. Of course, this is an example of that discussion today. But in terms of the mission itself, I would say if you were to try and crystallize a key difference, the ambassador is very much focused on the external face of the mission, and of course has a key leadership role in the mission itself. I have a sort of auxiliary role of supporting the management side of missions operation, with a particular focus on maintaining a very strong collaborative modus operandi with our other agencies. So one of the striking things for me to be in a large mission such as this is the very strong engagement across our interagency network. So for instance, we have a defence section, a defence attaché, we have an agricultural section, we have a commercial section through Austrade, and we have a very important home affairs section as well. So these agencies are all undertaking very important whole of government roles, and we need to make sure we're as coordinated as we can be in ensuring how we pursue our national interests is done in a way that all the stakeholders keep informed and are aware of the sorts of priorities that each agency has. The other role that I have in any workplace, but the morale is a very important element of any leadership team, and we, particularly when families are overseas, and I would say particularly in the current circumstances where we are facing the challenge, the crisis of COVID-19, maintaining morale within the embassy is a critical function, and one that I myself spend a lot of my waking time working on. It's a collaborative effort. We need to reach out not just to the A-base, but we have a very important sort of LE, our locally engaged staff team that work for us. And we also have our broader community, the dependents, the families, those that are undertaking homeschooling. And so there's a lot of moving parts that we're working on and ensuring that they have regular opportunities to communicate with us. We message out to them the sorts of things that we are trying to do, and maintaining safety and security of our overall operation. So they're the sort of key, the two key elements that I would focus on in particular, beyond a broader engagement with the wider community.
Yeah, it's a very, very broad-ranging role, and given, as you said, the importance of the trading relationship between Australia and Korea, it's very clear that there's a necessity for such a position, particularly because, as you state, like, we engage with both arms of both you and James. I mean, just a little bit of a tangent, but I'm quite interested in that second piece that you mentioned around just the engagement of your staff and the behaviours of people, and just setting the right culture. It's a very Australian thing to set the right culture and lead from the front. How have you found that relative to your local employees, and equally where you've seen it across other jurisdictions in which you've operated? How does that compare against those other regions?
Well, I think the key thing that we always take with us when we go overseas is that we are very much governed by the expectations and standards that that the Australian community would expect of us. So there is that's crystallised in our own code of conduct, and we of course need to be setting a very clear example in how we engage and conduct ourselves, both privately and also in our official role. And that's the reality of our work overseas, is that we're never really on our own. We're never really able to, if you like, conduct ourselves in a way that maybe you might in Australia without the scrutiny because of our very visible public role that we play. And one of the things that we often get asked is, you know, what about if you get a traffic fine, or you know, can you just park your car anywhere and flout the local law? And of course the answer is no. And the reason is because the average Australian punter back in Canberra or in Sydney or Melbourne wouldn't take kindly to a diplomat from another country refusing to take a breathalyzer, or drinking it under the influence of alcohol, or indeed not paying fines. So we had one funny instance in Geneva where there was a speed camera that we hadn't observed just near outside the place that we were living, near the airport. And I'd like to say it was my wife that was always the one that clocked up over the speed limit. But the problem is that the Swiss authorities only gave us the fines after about 1 year of accumulating these obviously infractions. And suddenly I was told by the mission management that we had a $2,000 fine to pay. And I said, well, how does that work? He said, well, you've got 8 speeding fines here. And I said, well, we didn't even have time to reform our ways, which of course, if you had known that there was this speed camera there. But of course, there was no ground to stand on, and we had to pay that speed fine. But the moral of the story is, yeah, we have to maintain the sorts of standards of behaviour and conduct that the Australian community expects of us, and that's quite high.
I'm quite happy to hear that you're utilising taxpayer funds very efficiently, not to fund people's fines and claiming diplomatic immunity. So I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you. That's quite an interesting adjunct between, you know, some of these other topics in terms of you talk about an ambassador, and you've had a position as an ambassador and a high commissioner and head of mission. So like, just for the uninitiated, whilst we talk about these different titles and functions, what is the classification difference between each of those titles you mentioned?
So it is quite confusing, particularly when you're in a location like Africa, to work through the difference, for instance, between ambassador and high commissioner. And I was in the unusual position in both my postings in Mauritius and in Nigeria to have in total accreditations to 11 countries as either ambassador or high commissioner. And of course, the distinction is whether a country is a Commonwealth country or not. Mm. So broadly, in all the Francophone countries, there you would be an ambassador. So I was Australian ambassador to Gabon, Australian ambassador to Madagascar, Australian ambassador to Comores. But of course, High Commissioner to Mauritius, which was a Commonwealth country, and High Commissioner to the Cameroon and to Nigeria. Where it got a bit confusing was in places like Cameroon and indeed Mauritius, which are both Francophone countries, but also parts of the Commonwealth. And often the question was asked as, you know, what was the difference? But essentially, you are representing your country as the head of the mission and representing the interests. But you then do have some interesting titles coming through. So for instance, my title here is Minister and Deputy Head of Mission. And Minister is indeed not a minister of how you describe it in Australia, but it is a level above a councillor. So for instance, I have 2 councillors in the embassy who report to me, a councillor for political affairs, that's Helen Horsington, and also our councillor for commercial and economic issues, and that's Russell Wild. So there is an interesting nomenclature that has a fine distinction. And then below that, we have what we call secretaries. So you have second secretaries and first secretaries. You even have a third secretary. So when I started in Islamabad, I was actually a third secretary. That's usually what you come in on your first posting. And a third secretary is, as it sounds, you are a general dog's body, a jack of all trades, and required to do whatever the mission management requires of you.
It's helpful to get that background in terms of all those various functions, because I have come across them as well in my time and interactions with the embassy here too. When you did arrive here in Korea, you've talked about your role and the way that you're leading a big team here. What goals did you set yourself in coming here, in approaching this role as a deputy head of mission?
I think a key aspect of our relationship is the commercial importance that it presents to Australia. I think everyone would be familiar that it is one of our top 4 trading partners. And the Asian region is of critical importance to Australia's economic well-being. And a country like the Republic of Korea is very central to that. And I think what is quite interesting about our relationship is there are many aspects of it that are almost on automatic pilot. So we have a very vibrant minerals export trade. So clearly iron ore underwrites that. A very vibrant energy trade. So LNG and coal are very significant aspects to that. We have about $3 billion in agricultural exports to the Republic of Korea, and over half of that is actually red meat, so $1.6 billion. Those industries and those export sectors, by and large, get on and do the job by themselves. There's actually not a lot of intervention and support that they require from the Australian government and indeed the Australian embassy. But where the sort of rubber really hits the road for us is in the other sorts of sectors, particularly the services sector. And this is where we can add value. Now, not so much in Australian-based services, which is tourism and, of course, education in Australian universities. Now, over time, we assume that they'll recover from the current minor setbacks that they're incurring with COVID-19. But where we can add value is in the areas that, in fact, a company like Macquarie is very interested in, the renewables, particularly hydrogen. That's a big focus for us. Woodside's got some very interesting collaborations on that. And we've got some very exciting engagement from our chief scientist, Alan Finkel, on pushing forward with the hydrogen agenda. Biotechnology and health is a very exciting sector that we see a lot of potential for us to work with our Austrade colleagues and to see where we can harness the sort of exciting energy coming out of Republic of Korea. And one only has to see what the response of Korea has been to COVID-19. Indeed, their work on potential vaccines already illustrates that the Republic of Korea has a very already a leap in front of a number of other countries. And we ourselves have some excellent sort of expertise ourselves in terms of the health sector, in the way that we conduct trials of particular vaccines and medications. So that's the second interesting area. But thirdly, there is an exciting world in the artificial intelligence sector and information technology. And Korea has so much to offer the world, but also Australia. And a number of our own startups have seen that potential, small to medium sized enterprises that have been coming here with their own interesting ideas on IT collaboration. One of the unknown stories in many parts of Australia about the Republic of Korea is the fantastic profile it has on gaming and the way that it uses and attracts this enormous following in the gaming sector, and the use of virtual reality. So they're the sorts of areas that we want to focus on. And a lot of the work that we can do is on helping identify opportunities and working to reduce non-tariff barriers. They're the sorts of priorities that I'm very keen to work on as we engage with the broader community. And this is an area that with AustCham ourselves and AustCham have a very collaborative but a significant potential to expand the way we work together, the embassy and AustCham.
Yeah, no, that's where we're trying to pull the members through into having these conversations in multiple different formats, whether it's these NextGen to hear from people like yourself, or we've actually had a number of economic briefings or health and wellness during the COVID-19. So we're trying to engage with our members as much as possible to hear what's in the market. And just for the benefit of members as well, there's a various number of committees across energy, sustainability and resources, financial services, these NextGen or doing business in Korea style seminar or webinars we're trying to do as well. I think it's the point you make on the gaming is we can be very thankful for the gaming enterprise here in Korea for the very, very high-speed internet that enables us to do these conversations virtually, such as this, without interruption and any sort of the circle of death there that gets you when you don't have a very high-speed internet. And it sounds like I need your assistance in the trade barriers around getting some more wine into the country, more beautiful Australian wine up into the country too.
Absolutely, and of course, one of the you mentioned about our collaboration with AustCham. One of the if you like, the very impressive elements of the bilateral relationship that struck me since I arrived is the number of ministerial engagements and visits that we've been able to host. And of course, AustCham has been a very important partner for that. So we've had, of course, the Foreign Minister, but also the Trade Minister, a Minister of Resources, and the Agricultural Minister, all in quite quick succession over the last 6 months before COVID-19 impacted on their own movements. But it's a obviously a very useful partnership for us as we try to promote our, if you like, commercial engagement. And one of the areas that we are particularly interested to advance is the investment and to increase investment both ways. And those signs are encouraging. And of course, there has been a momentary pause in that. And of course, we're trying to work around particularly the issue of the barriers in relation to border controls that are impacting on the two-way travel of that would facilitate greater investment. But these are sorts of things that we're working closely with Canberra on. We know that the broader business community are focused on, and of course, these two countries, Australia and Korea, you would have to say are at the sort of almost at the forefront of the curve where things are starting to normalise. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how Australia and the Republic of Korea can engage and to collaborate and to try to normalise as much as we can in this new post-COVID world, the sorts of interactions and capacity to trade and invest and to build up person-to-person links.
And it's the point you make on the interaction, the collaboration between the countries is interesting because of the way that Australia has looked to the Republic of Korea in terms of the way it has handled and tracked and traced the various cases here. And we had a session on that a couple of weeks ago as well. And Roland's been involved in other seminars as well, looking at what can Australia learn from the Korean situation. And you mentioned travel and the fact that we had a number of ministers come up last year, and that's come to a bit of a halt, as has all travel. How do you see the post-COVID world impacting travel in the future, particularly in terms of, and Europe's a particularly important case around, there was visa-free freedom of movement across borders in Europe, and many of the bilateral relationships Australia had, there was freedom of movement. How do you see that being impacted?
Yes, I think we really are at a defining moment of post Second World War history, and that's not to understate, I think, the enormity of the challenge. And I think we are all still trying to assess and evaluate what the medium to long-term impact of COVID-19 will be. We all know what the current impact is, and it's not pretty, and it's been a real shaking of our status quo and of what we've expected as the norm. Just being able to get back to Australia, for instance, now could take maybe a week to identify flights. It could take 2 weeks of quarantine in Sydney hotel before you even got to see your family. I think the key challenge for us all will be whether this will accentuate a fortress mentality, or by contrast, whether we can rise above a zero-sum game and actually maintain our connectivity and in fact build on it. And it's not too far-fetched to see a world where we could not just reshoring, but inshoring a lot of investment and manufacturing sectors. You could see barriers put up that would impede tourism, student travel, etc. And it wouldn't be a pretty world at all. And I think the challenge for us is to find ways that we can all work together, work for if you like, enlightened self-interest, and to make sure that however we come out of this, we haven't found ourselves in a world which is going to reduce globalization that we know it, and build up and fissure and fragment the sort of global internationalist world that we've come to expect. And I think the jury is out how we're going to play that. And I think it's actually a lot of hard work ahead of us to try to avoid the temptation to think narrowly, to think inwardly. And it's going to be a real challenge, because as we see it now, COVID-19 has had a big impact, firstly in North Asia. It's rolled out to the Americas, it's rolled out into Europe, but it's barely touched Africa. And indeed, it's barely touched a lot of quite vulnerable, fragile states. And so we're far from seeing the globe out of trouble. And the problem that we have all identified with COVID-19 is that this is not just a regional issue. You can't just put up a barrier and expect COVID-19 to forever be kept at bay. What affects one country and what affects one region will ultimately disseminate and impact on us all. So the sooner we realize this is a global challenge and that we need a global response, I think the better we'll all be in this post-COVID world. And I'd love to think that there'll be a positive answer to that. And indeed, I'm an optimist, so that's what I believe will unfold. But I think we still need a lot of engagement, a lot of discussions, and a lot of understanding. But I think Korea has set a very good example. And I think how it's managed the COVID-19 challenge is impressive, and I think there are many lessons that we should be able to take from it.
Yeah, I can take many paths from that response in terms of, there's a number of things you've touched upon there, but one particularly, I guess, to focus in on would be, Australia shut its border to Korea pretty early on when things were starting to spike down in Daegu, as they did with the Chinese border. Do you see there's now an opportunity that, given the way that Korea has handled the situation, that there's an opportunity between Australia and Republic of Korea because of the potential opening of borders? Is that going to be one of the first borders to open? Is there a benefit for supply chains and collaboration between the economies?
Yes, it's of course a real conversation that is going on in Australia now, as they are moving gradually to unwind some of the restrictions. I think everyone would be aware, and logically this would make sense, that the trans-Tasman bubble would be the first international frontier for us to essentially whittle away and to ensure that movement is able to regenerate across the Tasman. And I think that may happen sooner than later. One of the things that is, of course, being pushed within Australia, and something that Korea has been, I think, one of the leading countries in implementing, has been the use of the tracing apps. And I think the reality in Australia is that they are very keen to be able to have a more sophisticated tracing mechanism that indeed satisfies the requirements of privacy and the concerns that some members of the public would have on those issues, to give the confidence to be able to crack down on and follow up on any next wave or cluster outbreaks. And this has been one of the things that Korea has been a very successful exponent of, and witness the current outbreak in Itaewon, near where you and I both live, Andrew.
Yes.
How they have been very quick to push ahead with the tracking and tracing. So I think the Korea indeed would, by any level of measurement, be one of the earlier countries beyond the trans-Tasman bubble that Australia would be looking to find some modus operandi where we can renew links. And of course, already we do have some exemptions that we can push ahead from a business case with countries like the Republic of Korea. But at the moment, even us, even public servants and diplomats, when we return to Australia, we still face the 2-week quarantine. And I think that is going to be a challenge as we work out ways to reopen air links and to normalise the sort of patterns of travel that we're used to in the past.
There's a topical question here on that collaboration, actually, is that there's a lot of chemical and biotech research in Australia, but little manufacturing, whereas Korea has both. Have you seen COVID-19 suggest opportunities for more collaboration in this area?
I think absolutely. I was interested over the weekend. There was a report of one of, in fact, Australia's largest capped company, CSL, which has now established a subsidiary here. CSL, of course, works with blood plasma, but it is indeed very much starting to engage on the COVID-19 challenge. And it has a very interesting partnership that it is working within countries like Korea, but also beyond the North Asia region. And I think this is a very exciting area that Australia and Korea can be working closely on. And when you have big companies such as CSL, there are many other smaller, medium-sized companies also that are working that space. So I think it's a particularly promising sector for us to develop some very interesting and I think potentially beneficial links.
And that decision itself, actually, to shut the border that we started there with between Australia and Korea, that was made in Canberra, and those decisions are typically made in Australia. But how much influence on domestic policy is able to be? How much pressure can you insert or push down into Canberra to make decisions and help create the policy decisions back up here?
Well, I'd love to be able to say that we have enormous influence, Andrew, but I'm not sure that you or those engaging in this session would believe necessarily. I mean, we, of course, our role is to, of course, look for opportunities where we can advance our own Australia's national interests. And there are initiatives that we can propose and do from time to time to feed back into the machinery of government back in Canberra. And of course, ultimately, the way foreign policy is developed is a very iterative process whereby you have many stakeholders, not just DFAT. You have intelligence agencies, you have security interests, you have defense, you have economic issues. The Treasury, for instance, I've been in touch with Treasury colleagues earlier today. And I think at the end of the day, Australian foreign policy, including how we engage commercially, has to, if you like, come to terms and calibrate all these different elements. And so when you have an iterative process that ultimately becomes a decision made by Cabinet, we are just one of the stakeholders in that. But for a country like Korea, where the importance of it is at the very highest of levels. I mean, Korea is a country that we share two very significant similarities with. By far and away, we have China as our largest trading partner, and we have a US alliance. We also are part of the Indo-Pacific region, and the Republic of Korea shares a very complementary economy with Australia, but a very comparatively sized economy. So roughly we are of equal weight in terms of G20 clout. And I think that opens up enormous possibilities for us, and Australia and Canberra is very interested in the sorts of collaborations that we can have with a country like Korea. So when we come up with suggestions and recommendations and ideas, they usually resonate back in Canberra. So to put a positive spin on it, we like to think that we do have some influence.
It sounds very much like a big corporate as well, the way that, there's an operation there, that there's many people, it's decisions by consensus too, hence the Cabinet. Looking back at yourself again now and switching away from the role that you have and actually back to you, and trying to give our members some answers to some of the good questions we've got here. Does the necessity of knowing the local language, and well for that matter, differ from post to post in terms of pursuing effective diplomacy in our national interest?
Having knowledge of the local culture and being able to communicate is a critical element in diplomacy, in diplomatic toolkit, if you like. And it is a significant element of when we are looking for graduates that come into, for instance, DFAT, more often than not, they will have some kind of language aptitude and capability beyond just English. And I think that in itself reflects the importance of language. We ourselves here offer language, in-country language training to our more junior officers, and actively support their role in getting out there and making contacts in their own circles, whether it's amongst National Assembly members, if it's with its NGOs, with civil society, with think tanks, and they play a very important role. I would have to say, in all honesty though, we are very reliant on our locally engaged staff to facilitate the sort of direct language communication that we need to have in a country like this. Now, of course, when we deal with a department, a ministry such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, most of them, if not all of them, will speak English. But the moment you go beyond that, of course, knowledge of Korean is very important. And that applies in many of the other countries that I've served, in Cambodia, in Pakistan, in Africa, of course. And this is why in our foreign mission footprint, the importance of our locally engaged staff cannot be it cannot be overstated. They are an absolute critical element to the work we do, and we rely on them a lot. Thankfully, in a place such as Korea, in Seoul, we have a fabulous locally engaged staff contingent, and it's a very important collaboration that we have. And essentially, we would be half the sum of our parts if we didn't have that capability.
And any instances in your career or postings where you've made embarrassing mistakes speaking or translating something?
Well, now that's I would have to sort of take that one on notice, Andrew. I'm sure I've made many errors. I do remember a time when we must have been. It must have been a time under the presidency of George Bush, and there was a translation occurring in French of President Bush's name that was presented to me as I was seeking the translation from my local translator, and he'd obviously utilized some translation, automated translation service. So the French translation of Bush came out as the equivalent word in French, which of course wasn't the American president's name. But miscommunication does happen from time to time, that's for sure.
No, I'm very sure of that in my current position too. And we're very, very lucky for those locally engaged workers as well. And no doubt Australia is the beneficiary of that across the world. So I can't thank that team enough, no doubt. No, only a couple of minutes left. So if anyone has any final questions, please post them and we'll try and get to them in the time we've got left. But I think just finishing, what's been probably just good to hear about what's been one of your greatest achievements, and any final, comments you could make for people and particularly students considering a career in foreign policy.
Well, I think if we were to try to truthfully evaluate what our greatest achievement was, it's probably rather banal, the unspectacular, hard slogging of trying to build understanding and convergence of views across disparate elements. And I learned that the hard way when I was in Geneva and New York working on disarmament-related issues. And it got to the point where a good day in the office would be agreement on selected phrases of a joint statement that we were able to produce in the Conference of Disarmament, but really hardly the sort of world-shattering, changing, if you like, developments that I would love to be able to testify to. There was one instance where I was, I guess, proud of the role that I was able to play in a very difficult and traumatic circumstances. It happened when I was in Cameroon. I'd arrived on a day that a plane, a chartered aircraft from Sundance Resources, which is an Australian mining company, had just gone missing, and had 12 people on board, including 7 Australians. It was very clear right from the outset that something awful had happened. The problem was the plane had gone down in a very remote jungle region, tropical jungle, and it was not immediately clear where the plane was. After 3 days, we located it. I was put in charge of the consular response team. It was in the northern part of the Republic of Congo. We then had to retrieve those, the bodies very tragically had all passed away, then have them identified through a disaster victim response team that we brought out from Australia. There's a lot of profile on the case. The foreign minister at the time was Stephen Smith. He was from Western Australia. The team was from Western Australia. I was talking daily with the foreign minister, giving him progress on the issue. And it took us nearly 6 weeks to conclude the identification process, and then to arrange the transportation of the bodies back to Australia. But there were some wonderful people that we relied on, both within Brazzaville, but also with the mining company, the extended family, those other colleagues that came out from Canberra who assisted me in the consular response team, but clearly also these incredible disaster victim identification experts that had worked in areas such as the tsunami in 2004 and had come to help us in this instance. They were all, of course, experts in their field, and you know, it was one of those issues that I learnt so many lessons from. It was very moving, and I was glad that we were able to bring some sort of closure and resolution for the family members involved.
Yeah, no doubt, a very challenging time in your career as well, and for want of a better word, you know, a good outcome to give that closure to the families. I do remember that situation as well, actually, because as you said, it was very, very public situation. Look, that's probably all the time we have for today, and thank you very much, Ian, for diving into your life and hearing about your background and that path to being the Deputy Head of Mission here in the Australian Embassy in Seoul. It's been very much appreciated, and enjoyed having a chat to you, and look forward to seeing you out on the bike again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you, AustCham too, for organising.
Thank you, and once again, thank you very much, Ian, for your time, and thank you, Andrew, who's working remotely at the moment. I really appreciate your time today. Just looking ahead, we do have a webinar next week, which I welcome everyone to join. It is it's North Korea update, rumours, risk, and economic implications, and it's with our partners from Korea Risk. So once again, I would like to thank everyone for today and their questions. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to speaking to you all soon. Thank you very much.